Okay, so are you ready to dive into a question that's like, well, it's a big one.
Oh, I'm ready. Hit me with it.
Okay, so this is it, like always right to follow the law, even when,
Even when it feels wrong.
yeah, even when it feels completely wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, you shouldn't, but you kind of have to.
Right. Like you're caught between a rock and a hard place. You got your gut telling you one thing, but then there's the law.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to unpack today.
I love it when a deep dive starts with a good head scratcher,
Yeah. And this one, it really is.
And the podcast episode you shared, Should We Always Follow the Law? From the Moral Dilemma series, they really don't mess around. They throw you right into it.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine this. You're face to face with refugees desperate for help, but your country's laws totally against helping.
Oh, man. Talk about a moral dilemma, right?
It really is. It makes you think, what would you do in that situation? Your conscience screaming at you to help, but the law of the land saying, nope.
Yeah, it's that conflict between our legal obligations and just basic human compassion, It's tough, and it's something I think everyone grapples with at some point.
Absolutely. And the podcast, I have to say, it does a great job of highlighting that tension. It really makes you think.
For sure, for sure. And then they bring up these two contrasting philosophical views on this whole thing, legalism and moral law. Have you ever heard of those?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's classic philosophy, right?
Yeah.
Legalism basically argues that laws are like the backbone of society, right?
Yeah.
They're crucial for order, stability, keeping things from descending into chaos. And so a strict legalist would say that even if a law seems kind of unfair on a personal level, you got to follow it. It's about the bigger picture, the greater good.
So a legalist would be like, look, I get it. These refugees need help. It's heartbreaking. But if we start making exceptions for every little thing, where does it end? We got to have rules, right?
Exactly. It's about upholding the system, even when it's tough. But then on the flip side, you have the moral law folks. They believe laws should reflect, deeper ethical principles. Like the laws should be just in and of themselves. And if a law is fundamentally unjust, laws that were used to discriminate against certain groups of people, then they'd argue that disobeying that law might actually be the morally right thing to do.
It's like sometimes your conscience has to override the rule book, And it reminds me of so many pivotal moments in history where people did just that. The civil rights movement, for example.
Oh, absolutely. Those who fought for civil rights, they were challenging laws they believed were morally wrong.
Exactly. People like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., they put everything on the line, risked their freedom to defy segregation laws because their conscience told them those laws were wrong, period.
And they were willing to face the consequences. They knew they might get arrested, might face violence, but they did it anyway. They believed in a higher moral calling.
Yeah, it's about taking a stand, right? And it makes you realize that laws, while important, can be flawed. And sometimes they're even used as tools of oppression. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it's true.
It is. It really makes you confront this idea. Sometimes progress means challenging the status quo, even if it means breaking the law.
And then it makes you think, what price am I willing to pay for justice? What about you? What would you do?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think we'll have to save that for another deep dive.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms, but it's a question worth asking ourselves, right?
Sure, for sure. It's what makes this whole topic so fascinating, There's no easy answers. It's messy. It's complex.
It really makes you think.
One of the things I really appreciate about the Moral Dilemmas episode is how they brought in these personal stories from listeners.
Oh, yeah. Those were really something. It's like you can talk about these big philosophical ideas.
But then you hear about someone actually grappling with these choices in their own lives.
Exactly. And it makes it so much more real. Like, take Lisa's story, for example.
Oh, right, Lisa. That was a tough one.
She's the one she's at the store and she sees someone shoplifting food.
And well, at first, you're probably thinking, okay, shoplifting, that's wrong, call the cops.
Right, exactly. But then it turns out the person was stealing food to feed their kids, and she realized that, and it totally changed everything.
Lisa ended up deciding not to report it because she felt like, like in that moment, making sure those kids had something to eat was more important than strictly following the law. Right?
Yeah, like what kind of choice do you even have in that situation,
It's heartbreaking, really. It really illustrates the idea of situational ethics. Where you have to weigh your options in the heat of the moment and make a judgment call. No easy answers there, that's for sure.
Tough spot to be in.
Yeah.
Really makes you think. And then there was Michael.
Oh, Michael. His story was really interesting.
So Michael's story takes us from like these individual acts of conscience to something bigger, more like collective action. He was involved in a climate change protest.
Right. And the protest, they were denied a permit. So he knew he was technically breaking the law by being there.
Yeah, so he was super conflicted, but ultimately he felt like the urgency of, fighting climate change outweighed his obligation to follow the rules in that instance.
Right. Right. He was willing to put himself on the line for something he believed in, even if it meant breaking the law. That's a powerful thing.
It really is. And it speaks to this whole other layer of this dilemma, right?
Yeah.
When is civil disobedience justified?
Exactly. It's like that saying, sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
Ooh, I don't know if I'd go that far. But I get your point. Sometimes you got to shake things up to make progress. It definitely throws a wrench into that whole black and white thinking.
I hear you. And to be fair, I don't think the podcast was saying laws are meaningless or anything like that. Laws are important. They provide a framework, help society function,
They're like guardrails, They keep us from veering off the road.
Exactly. But it's like you were saying, there's this big, messy middle ground where things aren't always so clear cut.
Totally. It's like a big old gray area. And that's where it gets really interesting, I think.
For sure, because it's in that gray area where we're forced to look inward, examine our own values, decide what we're willing to stand up for. It's not just about blindly following external rules anymore.
Yeah, it becomes a lot more personal. It's like, how do I engage with these laws? What feels right to me, even if it's uncomfortable? And I loved how the podcast put it. What kind of society do we want to live in?
Ooh, yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Do we want a society that just blindly follows every rule, even when it leads to what feels like harm or injustice?
Or do we strive for something more, something more humane, where there's room for individual conscience to come into play?
Right, and where we're willing to have those tough conversations, even when there's no easy answers.
It reminds me of that quote, I think it's Dostoevsky, the one about, you can judge a society by how it treats its prisoners.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
But maybe we can update that for, modern times.
The 21st century remix.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. Like, you can judge a society by how it wrestles with its laws when those laws, when they don't actually protect people, when they maybe even cause harm.
Yeah, that's powerful. Because it's not enough to just have laws, right? It's about how we choose to, live with them, how we interpret them, enforce them, even challenge them when we need to. That's what really matters.
Totally. And that's where it becomes so, personal, because what feels like the right thing to do, the moral choice, it can be different for everyone, even in the same situation.
Oh, absolutely. We all bring our own baggage, right? Our values, experiences, all that shapes how we see the world and how we react to these dilemmas.
For sure. And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating, right? You can talk about legalism, moral law, all that stuff, but then you hear these real stories.
Right, like Lisa and Michael. Their stories really bring it home.
Exactly. They make you think, okay, if that was me right there, what would I actually do?
Yeah. Because it's one thing to sit back and analyze these dilemmas, but it's a whole different ballgame when you're the one who have to actually make the call.
No kidding. It's like suddenly the stakes are real,
Totally. And I think that's what the Moral Dilemmas episode does so well. It doesn't give you any easy answers. If anything, it just leaves you with more questions.
Oh, for sure. More questions than answers. And that last one they asked, the one about, what was it? Oh, yeah. What kind of society do we want? Man, that's been stuck in my head.
That's a big one, right?
Right.
It makes you step back and think about the bigger picture. Like, are we okay with a society that just blindly follows every rule, even when it feels wrong?
It's almost like it's not enough to just think about our own individual choices, Like, we have to think about the kind of world we're creating with those choices, the kind of system we're upholding.
Absolutely. And that's where I think this conversation gets really interesting,
Yeah.
It's not just about philosophy or ethics anymore. It's about, taking responsibility for the world around us.
And maybe there isn't one right answer, right? Maybe it's more about asking the tough questions, being willing to grapple with those gray areas, and like you said, taking responsibility.
Exactly. And being willing to have those uncomfortable conversations, even when it's tough. Because ultimately, whether we choose to follow the law, bend it a little, or even break it, our choices, they have an impact.
They really do. And I think that's a really good place to wrap up, It's been a great deep dive, lots to think about. So, hey, to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for being part of the conversation. And keep thinking, keep questioning. It matters.